All right. Let's go ahead and get started. Bill, everyone, can you see my screen okay?
Yep, looking good.
All right, perfect. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. We are hosting our 27 virtual V2T migration task force webinar. So this is our NSX V2T migration session here. My name is Andrew Grismore, and along with William Grismore, we're going to take you through a little bit of our experience that we've had out in the field with doing these V2T migrations for our customers, talk about some of the strategies, concepts, and what we think is the best way to help you guys get from NSX-V to NSX T. So let's go ahead and get started. Bill, you want to give a quick intro about 27 Virtual?
Yeah, sure. I'll keep it short. So 27 Virtual is a VMware partner. We focus on all VMware products, vSphere, NSX, vSAN. For the purposes of this, we've been really focused on doing V2T migrations over the last 6 months or so. So we can definitely help customers and other partners with V2T migrations wherever possible. We did start out originally as an education company. We've been doing consulting services since about 2016 and have grown from there.
All right. Oh, excuse me, guys. So just a couple of announcements here. We wanted to make sure that you guys know that there is a survey at the end of this. So please go ahead and fill out that exit survey. I was trying to just add that there at the last second so that you can provide some feedback about the webinar. We really want to hear what you guys found useful, what you guys think that should be added to the webinar. Give us a general idea of what you thought. Also know that this is being recorded. So this webinar will be actually posted on YouTube later on. So if you visit the 27 Virtual YouTube channel, if you visit the 27 Virtual website, make sure that you check out our webinars, previous webinars, other events, our podcasts. We've got a lot going on out there. And then also know that this is webinar format. So for Zoom right now, if you're a panel or if you're a participant, your mics are muted. But towards the end of the webinar, we'll actually open it up to questions. I can go through and unmute your mics and we can have a little bit of a conversation at the end. So first off, let's talk about why NSX T. Why do we want to migrate?
I think that the first thing there is that, we all know that we all know that NSX-V is scheduled for end of support January 16th, 2022. But there's a lot of reasons to go to T. I think the main thing there is if you focus on the NSX data center product, the big thing you're getting is better security. So with NSX T, all the new features that are being built are all focused on T. So, VMware is going to have a single product, the NSX T data center product or NSX data center product. And the biggest gain you're going to get is the additional security features. So you're going to get the IDS IPS capabilities, the last line acquisition and the network sandboxing and capabilities that brings, and some additional security acquisitions that VMware has made recently are all being baked into the product. So that's going to be a huge win. So you can do your microsegmentation, and then instead of using a third-party product, you can have a distributed IDS IPS built in instead of an appliance or something like that on the box. The other thing with that is that NSX-V was just the data center product. NSX T extended to the cloud. The other thing that's important with cloud, there's kind of two versions of that. There's public cloud native workloads with the NSX Cloud license, which allows you to put an agent on a native Azure instance or AWS instance or Google Cloud instance. And then there's the VMware Cloud on AWS product, or the VMC on AWS, or the VMware Azure solution, or the Google Cloud VMware Engine solution is another feature. Another new feature built into NSX Data Center that's pretty cool is NSX Intelligence. it allows you to build upon what VRNI does and gather more information about your firewall rules. And then the fact that now we also support containers, as you see on this slide, it can be a VM, it can be a container, the workload can be in the cloud. None of those things you could do with NSX-V, so that's important. We also support on the very right-hand side, if you have bare metal servers, we can actually put an agent on there to extend security out to that bare metal server. So there's a lot of reasons to go to T. Containers, networking to the cloud, additional security, none of those features we have in V. So what does it give you? It gives you full stack networking and security virtualization. So a new feature that was recently announced a few months ago, the ability to do federation. If you've ever done NSX-V multi-site where you have like a primary NSX-V manager and a secondary, federation is kind of the better answer to that because you end up with managers fully deployed at both sites. In NSX-V, you would have to promote the secondary to a primary and then redeploy the controllers. So with NSX Federation, you essentially have a full management plane and control plane at both sites, so you don't have to worry about that. So that's huge. The security we already talked about, the distributed IDS IPS, which I think is a really, really good add-on to your core microsegmentation that you're doing. NSX Intelligence is like a built-in version of VRNI. Now, vRealize Network Insight does look at physical network traffic flows, right? And the NSX Intelligence is really just your VMs, right? Full stack monitoring for modern apps. So you get the ability to support containers. So if you want to do containers with Tanzu, you get that capability. Another really important feature is something they're swinging back to is if you're on vSphere 7, you no longer need to build a separate NVDS. So one of the things with T that was a little bit challenging is building out additional NICs to build an NVDS, like a third switch, standard switch, virtual distributed switch, NVDS. To kind of solve that problem, as long as you're vSphere 7, you can now, when you prep your host for NSX T, you can just point to the VDS and you can have your NSX T segments, whether they're overlay segments or VLAN segments in that existing VDS, which makes it easier to deploy. So easier deployment's big, policy building to make, what do they call it? Infrastructure as code a reality, and be able to kind of push a button, have it go take off and do 5 steps for you, through some type of Ansible scripting or modulars, alarms and traps, and some neutron support out there for OpenStack. So you have some really good capabilities as you move into the newest version of NSX T. So some really, really good, exciting stuff. A lot of good reasons to move to T, other than just all the basic things it brings you natively. Where to begin?
Yeah, I think that's probably the biggest thing, right? So I just want to give a little bit of context to everybody. When we first started doing this webinar, we started it almost a whole year ago already. And we've done some quarterly updates as we go along and want to make sure that we keep providing this information out to you guys. And the thing that's changed the most now is that we've really had a lot of experience doing these V to T migrations. We knew from the very beginning that it was going to be a task that we had to undertake and start helping get customers from NSX V to T. But now we've actually done it. So the webinar has been able to evolve a little bit, and we can talk about our experience of where to begin and what we've had the most success with. And Bill's done a number of them. I've done a few of them. Our team has gone through and we created this migration task force to do these V to T migrations. So a lot of this knowledge and a lot of what you're going to get from us and Bill today is that real world, what's the most important things to think about when it comes to a V to T migration. So we narrowed it down in the beginning to 3 keys here. And Bill, if you want to talk through a couple of them, you can do that. And then I'll talk a little bit about how we can translate some of those objects and what some of the V objects look like in T.
Yeah, so the first one is interesting, right? So understand how T constructs convert to V. And there's really 2 parts to that, or maybe 3 parts. There's networking, there's security, and then there's the services like the load balancer, the VPN capabilities, those type of things. The first one would be the networking. There's no more concept of a DLR control VM. Some customers have a multi-site where they have like a weighted route where I'm going to go to these edges with a IBGP weight of 60. and I'm going to go to these other edges at the other site with the weight of 0 because it's the less preferred path. We can't do that in T. So that's like a real basic difference. There just is no control VM anymore. Instead, we have the concept of a T0 and a T1. So understanding the difference between the basic networking architecture is important. The good news with T is that new networking construct supports multi-tenancy much better. And there's going to be some more news about that coming out with 3.2 before VMworld. So they're building upon that. The other one would be security. I would highly recommend that before you migrate from V to T, that you look closely at your firewall rules and then deploy NSX T and compare the way NSX T does security to the way V does. For example, in V, we have the concept of an app ID. Maybe not all customers are using that layer 7 feature. You know, maybe you're still using your physical firewall or a third-party appliance, but if you're using app ID, in NSX T, it's now called a context profile, which is basically the same thing. But when you go to migrate firewall rules, there's some limits around what you can do in T with the app ID. Like if you have multiple app IDs, let's say I'm looking for SQL injection or whatever it might be, and I'm also looking for exchange traffic, and I've got one firewall rule with 2 app IDs in V, and then I also have services. When I go to migrate that firewall rule over in NSX T, if I have multiple context profiles, my services have to be set to any. So what I can do is before I migrate, I can clean up my V firewall rules a little bit. I don't have time here to talk about every single one of those, just as an example, but there could be some things you could do from a networking standpoint to plan for, from a firewall rule point to stand for, to prep for. And then another big one is the load balancer. The load balancer in NSX T is completely different than the regular kind of one-arm load balancer VM and V. And as a matter of fact, with that in mind, AVI would be the way to go in the future. So if you're thinking about moving core services, there's a little bit to think about with networking. There's a little bit to think about with security and how they translate those objects, right? You know, another one, for example, would be if I have a VM and a firewall rule, I can't just translate that right over. It's going to have to go into a group. I can't just go into T, go to the firewall rule and just put a VM directly in the rule, like naked. You can't do that. It's got to be in a group. So there's some differences there. And the load balancer is completely different. But the fact that there's AVI is huge.
Yeah, we'll have some time to go through some more of your experiences with that at the end. And also, if you guys have any specific questions about how something in your environment might translate, maybe we can get those questions in toward the end as well. If you have a question, you can also use the Q&A button that's in the Zoom, and we encourage questions. So Bill and I were both NSX instructors as well as running this consulting business, which is what we do with our time now. But we happily answer any questions. So feel free to just pop a question in the Q&A if you have one. But yeah, I mean, definitely, and we'll also take a look at a visual of how some of the networking objects translate. But for sure, you have to have that initial understanding of what you're doing and what you're going to transform into and what's even an acceptable object in NSX T before you go forward. And then just run us through the couple of migration methods, because we're going to go into detail on that as well.
Yeah, you got to choose a method. You're either going to do an in-place upgrade, or you're going to do a lift and shift, kind of like a parallel. You could even do a rip and replace. I've heard some people call lift and shift a rip and replace, and it's really not. Lift and shift means I have a single vCenter, and I'm not moving to a brand new greenfield like VCF deployment with a separate vCenter. I have the same vCenter, and I'm going to stand up T in parallel, and I'm going to shift things over from V to T. That's one of the most common methods. There could be another version of that where it's a completely new VCF, like I just mentioned, with a separate vCenter. And that might require like a HCX migration, or turn the VM off and move it over, or replicate it with a third-party tool, something of that nature. So there's all different ways to do it. I think the most common method you're going to find is the lift and shift, assuming you're staying within the same vCenter. And then detailed planning and validation steps. So learn T, get a lab set up, make sure you understand the differences, pick a method, and then test it, and just run through and test before you do anything on production. Because you want to make sure when you get to production that you've already got a really good understanding of how that's going to work. So in the Q&A, just to kind of spark some questions out there, maybe in the Q&A, can you guys put out there of the migration methods, which ones do you think you're going to do? Would you be doing an in-place upgrade, a lift and shift, or a lift and shift to a brand new greenfield? What type of migration are you guys thinking of? So Andrew, go ahead and take this slide.
Yeah, so when it comes down to the migration process, of course, we have to understand what's actually going to the NSX T environment. And of course, the end goal is to get your workloads over. And as Bill mentioned, depending on the migration method that you choose, you're going to have different options as to how the workloads actually move over. If you're doing an in-place upgrade, then the VNIC of your VMs will just plug into the new NSX T available segment. But we've also got to make sure that if you're going to new hardware, we have an exact plan of how we want to move workloads. Maybe we base it on the previous existing VLAN or segment or logical switch that you may be using in NSX-V, and choose how we actually want to move those VMs over. So that could be with an HCX migration or a vMotion, or making the storage available, like we said. So we've got to get the VMs onto the new platform. But we also need to make sure we're translating the actual objects. So our gateways now in NSX-T, we call our routers that live inside of our edges gateways. So your previous ESGs are going to turn into gateways that live in edges in NSX-T, and we have to make sure that we know how those are going to translate. And then, of course, the network services. So whatever you're using from a routing and switching perspective, a firewalling perspective, load balancing perspective, we need to make sure that those match up and we know how they're going to translate to those T objects, and then how we want to consume them. So those are all things that you've got to start thinking about today. And like Bill said, it may make sense to start normalizing your V environment so that it can match up with your future NSX-T environment. And that includes everything from the load balancer to the firewall rules and maybe the routing infrastructure that you have in place. So all of those are considerations. And then you have to start thinking about what strategy that you're going to use. So this is one of our keys, which is the migration strategy. Which one are you going to choose? Are you going to do the in-place migration with the migration coordinator all on your existing hardware? Are you going to go to a coexist within the same vCenter and use that to make available some hardware that you actually instantiate NSX-T on and then gradually move your workloads over to it? Or are you going to go to that greenfield where you have a full separate environment? Like Bill said, some of our customers have gone to the VCF model, and then we utilize some type of migration tool, whether it be your favorite replication tool or HCX, or just making the storage available. All of those are options to move to the new platform. So you've got to make a decision on exactly what you want out of it. And then, Bill, I know that you had some thoughts, and we'll talk about bridging a little bit as well, but maybe that plays a role in the decision that you make.
Yeah, I got a question here in the chat. So Daniel says, we'd like to do an in-place upgrade, but with cross vCenter primary and secondary managers and universal objects doesn't currently look possible. So we're looking at a parallel T environment and lift and shift. Yeah, I mean, definitely that sounds like a plan. The only workaround with the cross vCenter, and you may not be able to do it, but you can take one of those managers that's currently your secondary and just convert it to a standalone and then bring everything down. So you can make a shift in that. The other option is to do the other, stand up the other environment.
Yeah, unfortunately, there's only so many topologies that are guaranteed and work with the in-place migration coordinator. So yeah, like you said, unfortunately, with the cross vCenter and all those universal objects enabled, you can't do the direct translation to NSX-T as it stands today with migration coordinators. So like Bill said, you can bring it down to the level if possible. If not, then it's most likely going to be that lift and shift. And, Bill, I mean, I would say the vast majority of the environments that we've worked in so far have been lift and shift, have they not?
Yeah, I would say like 90% is going to be lift and shift. And then a small percentage are small single site environments you do an in place. And then the other ones are going to be, customers that just happen to be going to a greenfield. Usually that's just kind of a coincidence because they've already went out and bought all the new hardware and it just happens to be hitting at the same time. And that's where that comes in.
Yeah, I think that, probably the best candidates, well, first of all, you have to fall into those 5 supported networking topologies. We're going to go over a couple of them real quick, just so you guys can see how the objects translate. But, if you're just doing, let's say, firewall rules, because there are plenty of customers out there right now that have NSX-V and they're not doing the networking and they are utilizing the distributed firewall, that's probably a pretty good candidate for the in-place uh, move T, as long as, of course, you make sure that the rules that you're using match up with what can work in NSX T as well. So there may be some adjustments that you have to make that work. But yeah, here are some of the prereqs for the migration coordinator in place upgrade. Um, for your T test environment, should that be completely segmented from production? So Bill, as far as testing the setup T environment that you're moving to and practicing that migration process and making sure that your bridging works and everything else, what does that look like from your experience?
Yeah, you don't necessarily have to make it completely separate. I mean, if you have the hardware to do it, if you make it completely separate and you have firewall rules, you just got to figure out a way to sync the firewall rules over. We do use there's a third-party tool from a company called Rest NSX that has a feature called Policy Sync that you can actually stand up a V environment separate, and you can actually sync the firewall rules from V to V and get them over and then do it. You could get away with not doing that and just having like a little QA environment that's like a subset cluster of your production, and just target some VMs and some firewall rules there and migrate that just to get a sample. You just got to make sure that it kind of mimics what your staging or your production environment is going to look like, so that it's similar, so you can test it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the more interesting migrations that we've worked on was a very large distributed firewall deployment in full zero trust. And there are considerations as you start to move some of the VMs out of that zero trust environment into the NSX T world. So you actually have to make sure all the rules are built on both sides to be able to handle the firewalling traffic that needs to be handled at the VNIC of those VMs. So definitely some interesting scenarios that we've seen and been able to work through in that process. But
one more thought on that, just to kind of make sure Kevin understands. And it's interesting, right? Because you can do the parallel T deployment, and if you have firewall rules, you can pretty much just bring all the firewall rules over, but then only test a subset of what you want to bring over. So you basically you deploy T in parallel, you get everything set up that you want, you get all your firewall rules over. That's fine because it's kind of not being used. And then you can pick a subset, a cluster, particular VMs, build your bridges if it's within the same vCenter, and then you can test the migration and validate that that migration is going to be successful. To your point, Andrew, if I'm going to do a migration and I'm doing it in parallel and it's going to be like a phase migration, I got to be careful about having firewall rules in V and firewall rules in T, because if the VMs that have been moved to T need to talk to the VMs in V, I need to think about implementing firewall rules, IP sets on the V side and on the T side, depending on which tool I use. So that you can definitely do some interesting things with that. So the short answer is no, it doesn't have to be completely separate, right? That's the short answer.
yeah, and one thing I'm seeing here is this max of 64 hosts. That's been bumped up. So we'll talk about some of the updates to Migration Coordinator in a bit. But just know that for the lift and shift upgrade or move, I should say, to NSX T, you have to meet the requirements for the Migration Coordinator. And then when you think about the testing of the actual lift and shift, you definitely want to make sure that everything aligns on both sides, as some VMs live in one environment and some live in the other if you're not doing it all at once. So I wanted to go through with you guys a couple of the translations of the objects that we have in NSX-V as they move to NSX-T. This is based off of what Migration Coordinator would see it as. So if you were doing the in-place upgrade, this is what it would happen for Migration Coordinator. I don't necessarily want to go through an entire lesson in NSX-T on what these objects are, but it is good to have a really solid understanding of what you're actually moving to in the topology that is shown. So here's what you guys are probably used to seeing from an NSX-V perspective. We have our distributed logical router. We have our logical switches that our VMs are plugged into. We have our edge services gateways. In this case, they're in the ECMP mode, and we're using BGP for the north-south route exchange. So that's the typical NSX-V single site deployment. And then from a migration coordinator standpoint, it would translate that to, we have our segments, as they're called, our overlay segments, as they're called in NSX T down here that our VMs are plugged into. We have a tier 0. So this is a tier 0 gateway, and it has routing components, service routing components that live and exist in our edge nodes, very similar to our edge services gateways here. But the tier 0 in NSX-T also has a distributed routing component to it. So this single gateway, this single tier 0 gateway, has distributed routing that works very similarly to how the distributed logical router works. And it also has a service router component that does the north-south BGP neighbor relationship to the physical side as well. So if you have this scenario, this setup, and you were to do an in-place V2T migration with the coordinator, it would translate you to a single tier 0 gateway with the components that live in the edges as well as the distributed router component.
And if you decided you wanted a T1, it'd be real easy after that to throw a T1 in and just swing that uplink over.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to show here. So that topology would look like this over here on the right-hand side. So if you had that previous topology and it sets you up with the tier 0, the SR and the DR, you could always add in the tier 1 component as well, so that you can provide services at this level, so that you can have multi-tenancy at this level if you choose to. But the only way that migration coordinator is going to put you into this topology is if you are actually doing the multi-tenancy in B. So in this case, we see our logical switches, our DLR, a set of HA edges, possibly tenant edges, possibly providing some services here, and then ECMP north-south at the higher level provider edge services. So that would translate to getting a tier 0 for the actual north-south. So anytime you see a tier 0 in NSX-T, think of that tier 0 as what's going to provide you your north-south access and what's going to be exchanging routes with the physical network. And then the tier 1 is that level below. It can provide us, if we wanted to, we can provide those stateful services like you see over from the additional set of edges that we get with NSX-V in that HA format. So it has a SR component that can live in edges if we're doing those stateful services. And it also has an additional distributed router component. So this is just an example of getting your mind thinking about, what do I have in NSX-V right now? What do I want to have in NSX-T? What are some of those components? What do they look like? And this is just kind of a quick introduction to that idea. So you've got your networking components, you've got making sure your firewalling components will translate, and as well we have a full list of what you can have in V and how it would translate to T, if it will translate or not, and what you can do to fix that. That's just something that we've kind of put together over time and what we've seen with the firewall rules and how they translate. And then, like Bill mentioned, your load balancers as well. So Bill, you want to talk a little bit about the migration coordinator and what it can do now?
Yeah, so they had a new feature that I think most people wanted, and this is really the main one. Is the first one is the modular distributor firewall migration. A lot of customers, what they'll do is they will build a brand new parallel under the same vCenter T network environment, because it's kind of makes sense, right? You just kind of deploy NSX T, you build out all the networking, you get your edges deployed, you get your routing deployed, and really what you need to bring over, what you really need to bring over is the firewall rules, especially if you got a large list, unless you want to rebuild everything for some reason. So they added a feature with the modular distributed firewall in 3.1, where I can actually go into the migration coordinator, and there's an option within there to do a modular migration, and then you can pick firewall. And what it's going to do is going to migrate just the firewalls over. And it's interesting because it'll go through and analyze the firewall rules. And if it finds something that's not convertible, it's going to give you a warning. It's going to tell you to go fix it. Then you go back into your V and you make that change. There are some considerations there from a security standpoint and the impact, but you make those changes and you bring it back over, and it's going to let you migrate the rules. Now, the other thing that it does that's quite interesting is that when you migrate something from V to T in a phased lift and shift method, you can run into a situation where you can't move everything at once, right? So that means you're going to have an environment for some time, maybe a week, 2 or 3 weeks, whatever the migration phases are. Maybe you migrate over the weekend, whatever. You can have a situation where some VMs are on T and some VMs are on V, and they need to talk to each other. And you have 2 different firewalls managed by 2 different firewall managers, and they don't share information with each other. So if something in V needs to talk to T and something in T needs to talk to something in V, you got to have a way to solve that problem. So what the migration coordinator will do is it'll essentially take the IP addresses that are substantiated in the kernel in your DV filter, and it'll freeze them during this migration window so that you can then migrate workloads over. It'll build IP sets as necessary in T so that if you migrate things in a phase method, things can still talk to each other. And that's very common. So you're not typically going to be able to build up your route switch, migrate the firewall rules over, shut the VMs off, all of them in one fell swoop, like a big bang, I like to call it, and then bring things over. Typically, you're not going to do that. So because you can't typically do a big bang and just shut all your VMs off, you got to do this phase migration. And in the fact that the distributed firewall migration coordinator modular tool will let you freeze those IP addresses, saves you from some creative script or something that will gather all the effective members of your V and then inject IP sets into your V environment and make it get really messy. So that's a huge thing. It also supports a different set of VRA topologies. This would be if I'm considering, I have VRA and NSX as an endpoint. If I'm just using extensibility options, it doesn't really matter so much. Guest introspection is another one. Guest introspection support is there, but check with the vendor to make sure that their guest introspection service is supported in T, and test it first before you migrate it over. And then multiple VTEP support. So I can migrate from V to T and bring that over. And there's some scale numbers for you.
Yeah, those are the updated numbers.
Yep. So migration coordinator is pretty good. I mean, it'll do some pretty good stuff.
Yep. So, you know, like we were talking about as far as our keys go, you have to make some decisions on what you're going to do in terms of making that migration decision. What do we have right now? What do we want to see in the future? And what tool is going to best help us get there? So depending on your setup, like Daniel in his question talked about, you know, we're in a scenario where we can't necessarily use the migration coordinator. You know, what do we do then? Well, this matrix here gives you an idea of what is possible for the decision that you're going to make. And unless you're able to answer a lot of these questions that you see up here at the top correctly, or at least in a way that's going to lead you down this path, that is what's going to allow you to do that in place, at least migration coordinator. So now there's a little bit of flexibility in terms of the in-place capabilities of migration coordinator for the firewall rules. But from a networking standpoint, if you don't meet the criteria, or if you're doing the universal objects, multi-vCenter, multi-site, NSX, then you're going to be led down the path of a custom migration. So what we can provide, the reason why 27 Virtual created this webinar, the reason why we created the V to T migration task force, as we call it, our team of people who are actually out there in the field doing these V to T migrations, is that there's a lot of things to think about. Not only do you have to make a decision as to if you're going to use the migration coordinator or do a custom migration or use a third-party tool like REST NSX that we have taken advantage of, you have to make sure that what you have today is actually going to match what you want out of your NSX T environment. So we are here. If you guys reach out to us, if you let us know that, hey, this is something that you're looking for a little bit of assistance with, we've been through this process now multiple times. We're working in combination with VMware to get some of these done. We are on the front lines of actually doing these V to T migrations, and Bill's going to give you even some more of his experience here as we start to wrap this up and open it up to questions. But the bottom line is, if you need help, or if you're thinking about some of these decisions and which way to go and what some of our best strategies are, feel free to hop on a call with us. Let us know. Send an email to the email that you're going to see. You can send it to info@27virtual.com. You can send it to our business development person, Brent.Kaplan at 27virtual.com. And we can help you guys go through this process and get you to where you need to be from a migration standpoint from B to T. So we're here for you, and we can help you make this decision so that you're not on your own throughout this process. Is my PowerPoint frozen? Did I lose you guys?
Now your slide's just not moving forward.
Okay, let me try and fix that here. I'm gonna pause my share.
While Andrew's working on that, when you look at this slide where it says custom scripting, that's something that we've been doing quite a bit of. Like when you go to migrate something, if you do a, there you go. If you do a migration across the bridge in a lift and shift, you have to move VMs from the NSX V segment across the bridge to an NSX T segment. Once you get all the VMs from a segment moved across, you're going to have to flip the gateway from the NSX V DLR or UDLR over to the NSX T T1 or T0 DR. So we built a custom script that does that. So you can minimize the time it takes to make the flip. And there's some other interesting things with that as well. So lessons learned in the field, that would be one of them, right? So with the networking portion, bridging the proper configuration of the bridge. One thing that's interesting about if you do a lift and shift with bridging, one thing you all should be aware of is with the bridge, it's a one-to-one mapping. So it's from an NSX V segment to an NSX T segment with one edge node. So you have to consume an entire edge. You can't go in and do like, I can't deploy an edge and map 10 V segments to 10 T segments. I can only map one V segment to one T segment. And then if you want it to be highly available during that migration, you have to have an HA copy of that edge node. So that would be 2 VMs to connect a segment in V to a segment in T. We had a customer that we did this for where they actually stood up 18 bridges. So that meant they had 18 VMs. Now they opted not to have the standby copy, but even that by itself is a lot of bridges.
Yep. So Bill, real quick, can you talk about why somebody would want a bridge?
Yeah. So you would bridge. So that's a good point. So if you're going to do an if you're going to do a lift and shift migration in parallel to the same vCenter, so it's important that it's the same vCenter, very important there. What you're going to do is migrate VMs from V to T. So you're going to take them from a V segment to a T segment. Now, if you're okay with turning the VMs off, you don't need the bridge. If you want to minimize the outage during the migration, you want to put in a bridge. So if anybody ever did a bridge back in the NSX-V days to move something from a VLAN bridge to an NSX-V segment bridge, it's kind of the same concept. So we're extending the layer 2 between a VXLAN segment and a Geneve segment. So basically having the bridge allows you to migrate the VMs across without shutting the VM off or completely disconnecting the VNIC and bringing it over. So you basically can start a ping, do a continuous ping to the VMs. You can just go through the vMotion wizard. And when you go through the vMotion wizard, when you migrate, you actually see that target T segment you want to migrate to. And you can migrate it. And when you're pinging it, you can move it across the bridge and you don't lose the ping. Now, when you go to get once all the VMs are moved across the bridge, at some point, you're going to have to flip the gateway from the NSX-V DLR over to the T1 DR or T0 DR. When you go to make that flip, that's where a script comes in handy because it makes it a little bit quicker because I got to disconnect on one side and reconnect on the other. I can do the click, click, click method and probably do it in 15, 20 seconds or so. And then there's going to be some route convergence taking place when I drop the segment in BGP, right? The other thing is I got to now reconnect the segment on the other side. Now there's another technique you can do. You can put a route filter in on the T side to try to make it a little bit quicker. But no matter what you do, there's going to be a little bit of an outage when you go to flip the gateway. So the bridge minimizes just the migration portion so that you don't lose connectivity to the VM. But there's still going to be a little blip when you flip the gateway. But we want to minimize the blip when we go from V to T as much as possible. Load balancer, again, the load balancer in T is completely different. We would highly recommend just go to AVI. AVI Basic is going to be your road forward. That makes it a little bit less painful. It does require some planning for the VIP and the services. Anything special you have in a rule, like an iRule type concept, has to be considered. vRealize automation. So if NSX-V is an endpoint, you got to think about how vRealize is leveraging NSX-V. Is it using it to automatically deploy segments in a blueprint, like those external network connections? Is it leveraging NSX-V to do security to wrap around VMs that are deployed or not? All those things got to be considered. And then there could be some complexity in steps, if it is, to make sure that that is not going to disrupt how VRA is working when it goes to deploy new workloads, or how it affects workloads that were already deployed by VRA. The NSX versioning is very important. Customers now most likely will want to be on NSX version 6.4.8, right? And they want to be on vSphere 7.0. What that'll do is allow you to do a lift and shift. And when you do the NSX T prep, you don't have to create an NVDS. You can leverage the existing VDS, which can make your migration go much smoother. You don't have to worry about allocating 2 additional NICs over to a separate NVDS, right? So that's really, really important. And, know your license level too. If your license level, whatever your license level of NSX is going to affect what features you can do. Like if you don't have NSX Enterprise or Enterprise Plus, whatever they call it these days, you can't do federation, right? So if you want to do federation, you better check your licensing level. So the version, the code version you're on, and the licensing level are also important things to check before you go. On the right side, migration prep, if you're going to bridge with migration coordinator and you're going to bring workloads over, the segments that you build in NSX T must be created with the REST API call. And you want to make the VNI number that you have in V be the same VNI number in T. There's a feature in the migration coordinator when you migrate firewall rules and have a segment. In order for it to bring that segment over to the T side, you need to make sure those VNI numbers match. So there's a very specific step you have to go through with bridging with migration coordinator and bringing over firewall rules. So there's definitely some things to consider there. And rule normalization. Try to simplify the rules to match. Know the difference between firewall rules in V and firewall rules in T. One other little side note that we didn't put on this slide is NSX T doesn't support the web-based SSL VPN. So if you're a customer that's using the web-based SSL VPN, you're going to have to find a different solution, a different VPN solution, like an open VPN or a jump box or something, because it's just not available. Yep.
Awesome. So that is going to wrap up the slide deck section of this V2T webinar. Hopefully you guys were able to learn a few things, gain a little bit of insight on some of the strategies and things to consider as you look toward NSX T as your next version of NSX, and to get all the benefits and additional capabilities out of it. Now, again, if you're looking for some specific questions or are just looking for a little bit of help in getting started with your NSX V to T migration, please do reach out to us. We're the ones who have been on the front lines of this from the very beginning. We were some of the first people actually out there deploying NSX T to begin with. And then we were the first ones and one of the go-tos for VMware for actually doing the V to T migrations and helping customers get there and achieve their business goals along with the actual build out. So feel free to get in touch with us, brent.kaplan@27virtual.com. And please don't forget to fill out the survey that will automatically pop up at the end. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to actually enable your microphones so that you guys can ask questions if you like. So we're going to open it up to the floor. If you have anything that you'd like us to answer, feel free to ask. Bill, if you want to just pop up the participants tab and click the allow to talk button along with me, I'll start at the top if you want to start from the bottom. And we'll open it up to questions. So you guys will see your microphones pop up.
I don't have permissions to do that.
Oh, I'm doing it then. I'm going through the list. So if you see your mic pop up and you can unmute it and you guys have a question, feel free to fire away. I'm just going through the list.
There we go.
There we go. Yep. So if you guys have any thoughts or questions or specific scenarios you'd like us to talk about, see if we've seen it in the field, go for it.
Yeah, I just thanks for that. Some good info. We actually contacted VMware Professional Services for this, and they didn't seem to know a lot more than we did, to be honest. Yeah, what's your solution for local egress? Because that seems to be quite easy with V, and I'm not sure it's fully supported with T.
Yeah, I can take that one, Bill.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so the only way to truly replicate how local egress was done in V is with the NSX T federation. So the good news is if you're doing local egress before, you probably already have the multi vCenter NSX enterprise level licensing. So if you go to T, then the solution is to do the NSX T federation setup. So you're going to have global managers on top of the local managers at each site. And for the first time, once you log into those global managers, you're going to see locationality as an option in terms of the scope of where you set up your routing. And it allows you to essentially tell based off of location where the segments exist, where you want the traffic to go north-south. And that is the local egress concept of it. So we've actually done some of the NSX Federation, deployed it, done some of this local egress already, and have had great success with it. So that's really the only option to truly replicate the local egress capabilities is to go to Federation.
Okay.
One thing we did for one customer that was kind of interesting is they wanted Federation, so we did the Federation, right? And then they were a smaller customer and they were doing static routing, which is fine. And what we found is that if you do a Federation with a tier 0, and you just have a tier 0, a stretch tier 0 and a stretch tier 0 DR, and you don't add a T1, a stretch T1 underneath it, you can put a segment directly on that tier 0 DR that's stretched, and then you can leverage static routing on that. So I'm not saying that static routing is the solution for you, Daniel, necessarily, but there's some interesting, yeah, there's some interesting things you could do with it. So it's interesting.
Cool, thanks.
Any other thoughts, questions? That's a great question. Thanks, Daniel.
And, for those people out there that are building brand new greenfield environments, HCX is a fantastic tool. They have a new feature. They have this mobility feature where it can actually kind of map traffic flows. So it can actually see how VMs talk to each other. So if you want to make sure you're bringing VMs over with HCX kind of in a prescriptive manner where you bring the VMs over together in a group based on that communication, that's a new feature they added. They also recently added an HCX, I think it was in 4.0. I know 4.1 just came out the other day, where it can actually migrate your security tags over as well. So in-place upgrade, lift and shift with bridging, if I were to try to summarize it for everybody, those are kind of your options. In-place upgrade, lift and shift, leverage bridging, unless you want to take a big bang and just shut everything off and move it all at once. And then you have kind of the greenfield with HCX or some other third-party tool. It doesn't have to be HCX, but HCX has some really cool capabilities. Just remember, if you're using HCX Advanced, you're going to do a bulk migration. And that means that it can do the 200 VMs or whatever based on your service mesh, but it's got to shut them off at the source. So unless you have the HCX enterprise license, you're not able to bring them over and keep them powered on. Now, for a lot of our customers, we found that doing the HCX migrations with the bulk, if you do that on a planned outage window, late on a Saturday night or whatever it is somewhat acceptable, right? It depends on the bulk and what the scope is, what you're trying to accomplish, right? You just got to let your customers know that there's going to be an outage during this window and you get it all migrated over. And you can do a lot of testing and planning for that as well, right? So HCX doesn't have to be a data center move. It could be within the data center just to help with a V to T migration. Who out there is looking to migrate? Let's ask a few questions. So on this list of people hanging out, who's migrating? Anybody? Or who's migrating soon? Kevin's migrating. Who else is migrating?
Yeah, I see some familiar faces.
Yeah.
I know it's coming up.
We're migrating within a year from one data center to another.
Yeah, so Michael's going from one data center to another. He's probably going to be doing an HCX migration.
That is correct.
Awesome. Anybody else out there looking to migrate?
Probably why most people joined.
Well, what type of migration? So based on what we just discussed, we talked about doing in-place upgrade. We talked about doing lift and shift with bridging, and we talked about HCX. So raise your hand if you're going to be doing an in-place upgrade. Let's do that. Raise your hand if you're doing an in-place or would like to do an in-place. No takers. In-place is kind of risky, right? Because if it blows up in the middle, the rollback could be very difficult. And as a matter of fact, when you get into the migration coordinator, you get to a certain point, it says, you can't roll back anymore. So that's a little risky. Rollback can be difficult at some point. Who's looking to do a lift and shift? Who's going to do a lift and shift migration out there? Daniel, Kevin, anybody else? Lift and shift? I would say probably the most common is like I said before, 90% is probably lift and shift, right? Unless you happen to be standing up a new data center or you got a new stack that you just happen to be going to.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, any other thoughts or questions, anybody? Thanks, Bill. That awesome insight, by the way. Much appreciated. Anybody else? All right, I think we're at just about time. So I just want to say thanks everybody for joining. I really appreciate the time. And again, if you have any questions about this, feel free to reach out to 27 Virtual. If you want to see some of our other content, it's on our 27 Virtual YouTube channel, on our website, and we will talk to you guys soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.